with Forbes and some other notable publications leading the way, exposing that the proverbial emperor has no clothes. More and more mainstream media publications have begun deeming it safe to go after Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, and in ways that would have been unthinkable just a couple of weeks ago. Case in point, one major publication just equated watching The Rings of Power with eating cat food, and rancid cat food at that. With half of the first season now released for public consumption, that's hardly what you would call a ringing endorsement. Of course, that will make Amazon even more desperate, so I'll begin this editorial by looking into Amazon's continued censorship of negative audience reviews, before looking into the most recent batch of hilarious articles, and finally see what may come of this. We previously covered how, upon release, Amazon installed measures reportedly aimed at preventing negative review bombing. By contrast, positive review bombing, where countless users with little to no history leaving one-sentence 10-star reviews, like we also see on The Woman King, was of course allowed. What actual users experienced though was that their reviews were placed in limbo, and if awarding the series less than a 6 out of 10, the review would be purged regardless. They more or less said that reviews would only be fortified this way the first 72 hours. But unfortunately for Amazon, actual viewers kept on leaving more and more negative reviews even after the first few days of release. And so they've kept on periodically purging negative audience reviews ever since, which the quartering, among others, documented was done as recent as just prior to the release of episode 5, this week's episode. All of this is of course done in a desperate attempt to maintain some kind of illusion that the series is popular and actually competently made. Amazon wants you to believe that it's just subject to negative review bombing from Rossicists who take issue with the series' diversity, but everyone else loves it. Alas, the general interest and enthusiasm for this series, which is so high profile that it should have taken the whole world with storm right now, what with everyone being included and represented and all of that, is so low that the illusion of popularity is one which simply cannot be upheld. Indeed, in an article published September 20th, Forbes' Paul Tassi points out that, while I expected the various controversies the show generated to result in a barrage of negative reviews right at launch, the weeks that followed have not brought any sort of relief for the Rings of Power. By all available metrics, there is no place where fans have rallied to give the show consistently high marks, with scores not having improved noticeably the more episodes that have been rolled out, which you will sometimes see after some initial period of bombing/skepticism. That's a long-winded way of saying that this series has no fanbase rallying to its support. Or if it does, that fanbase isn't big enough to make any kind of visible impact in any review aggregator anywhere of any kind. But it's not just that fans aren't watching. Relative to the numbers they needed, no one is watching. Our good friend Valiant Renegade recently did an analysis of the viewership data which has been made available, and could from that conclude that not only was the Rings of Power resoundingly beaten by the House of Dragon in views, it may have been beaten by Cobra Kai as well. If this is the case, and there is no reason to think it isn't, the once protective entertainment media complex will have no choice but to turn their backs on Amazon in order to maintain their own credibility. Someone who did immense damage here by way of leading the charge was again Forbes. In our previous Lord of the Rings video, I maintained that their September 18th article, titled "The Rings of Power Has Inexplicably Terrible Writing," would embolden other media outlets to take on Amazon and stand up to the Rings of Power in ways that were unthinkable just a few weeks ago. And here we are. On September 19th, the Daily Telegraph published the editorial "The Rings of Power Would Have Tolkien Turning in His Grave," with the byline, "The sets are astonishing, the special effects are seamless and the costumes are incredible, but Amazon's Rings of Power has managed to be both pretentious and boring." After addressing the diversity complaints and Elon Musk's infamous tweet, Tolkien is turning in his grave because every male character is a coward or a jerk or both. Duncan Lay, the author of the piece, writes, "Now let me say that Musk is both right and very wrong. Tolkien grew up in Queen Victoria's England where, ironically, the idea of powerful female leaders was not popular. They certainly weren't a strong part of his Lord of the Rings, because you could count them on the fingers of a blind butcher. The strong women in Rings of Power would probably have Tolkien spluttering in his pipe, while colored characters would also have raised his bushy eyebrows, given his propensity for describing people as fair. But this is the crucial bit. Those are not the problems with Rings of Power. Not every male character is a coward or a jerk. Having some characters as colored doesn't ruin things. Ismael Cordova's elf Arondir is the most interesting of the show so far. It's the quality of the character that counts, not what their skin looks like. And that's the issue. You can see at a glance why Rings of Power is reportedly costing Amazon $1 billion to make. The sets are astonishing, the special effects are seamless, and the costumes are incredible. Sadly, the story is not. And more are noticing, he says, linking to the very Forbes article I just mentioned, and which we covered in the last video. Then, right on cue, he follows up with, "It's like being served rancid cat food on a beautiful antique plate." In years to come, I believe budding fantasy writers will be invited to watch the show because it's a case study on how to use every lazy fantasy trope imaginable. From the ever-burning torches to leaving at first light to ramshackle rafts that can survive impossible storms. It managed to be both pretentious and boring. And don't get me started on using two-handed swords in close combat. They would be more likely to kill the elf next to them than the orc in front. 2 decades ago, they might have gotten away with this. But in between there was a little thing called Game of Thrones that blew up the fantasy genre stereotypes. As everyone who's read Lord of the Rings knows, there's about 6 chapters in Book 1 that are a bit of a slog. Those chapters are like a Michael Bay action movie with dialogue by Quentin Tarantino compared to Rings of Power. And that's why Tolkien would be turning in his grave. Like all other articles, this one describes the diversity and inclusion, which Amazon touted as its main selling point as a non-issue, instead ganging up on the writers. It would appear that they are fair game. Under normal circumstances, they would have been fired and replaced for this, but if that is even an option here depends on the contracts with Amazon. If the existing showrunners try retooling this for the next season, or if new showrunners come in and try to change direction, I honestly don't think it matters either way. Like Star Trek Discovery, where each new season was a course correction from the previous one. There is no coming back from this failed beginning. Or do you think there could be? Let me know in the comments.